to the court. But I say to you that everyone who is angry with his brother shall be guilty before the court. And whoever says to his brother, you good for nothing, shall be guilty before the Supreme Court. And whoever says, you fool, shall be guilty enough to go into the fiery hell. Therefore, if you are presenting your offering at the altar, and there remember that your brother has something against you, leave your offering there before the altar and go. First be reconciled to your brother, and then come and present your offering. Make friends quickly with your opponent at law while you are with him on the way, so that your opponent may not hand you over to the judge, and the judge to the officer, and you be thrown into prison. Truly I say to you, you will not come out of there until you have paid up the last cent.
It's good to be home. I appreciate that a lot. I had a really touching moment this last week. Wednesday, I had another biopsy on my thyroid because the first one, when they jabbed and jabbed and jabbed, they couldn't get enough to make a reading, and so they made me wait a month, and then I had to have another one. And when I came out, I was feeling kind of queasy a little bit about it because it was a little uncomfortable this time. And my wife said, here, I've got this for you. Sit down. And I said, what's that? And it was a card from the ladies' class. Thank y'all. Just so encouraging and wonderful to get that card right there at that time. Thank y'all so much for that. I got my results back. Everything's hunky-dory, and we're going to go. They said check on it again in a year, so I assume the doctors are happy with what they didn't find. So I'm happy about that. We're glad to be home. Last Sunday, we spent our worship time with the church in Independence, Louisiana. A little small community and a little small congregation, but we got to worship with them, and it was great to do that. We made a point when we got off the ship to find a church there somewhere close that we could visit with. And I hope when you're traveling that you take advantage of visiting with other congregations while you're out and about, because just as much as it encourages us to have visitors, it encourages them when we visit them as well. So take advantage of those opportunities. We're going to talk today about thinking differently. We're going to continue our series on Jesus' life. After he concludes the Beatitudes, Jesus reminds us that people are watching us. They are watching. Some are watching to judge us. Oh, there's no doubt about that. There's always, when you see a Christian that falls or something like that, and it makes the news, especially, it makes extra news. People like to point out that a Christian has fallen and stopped living the way they ought to live. And I've got a friend that brings up a certain Church of Christ preacher that fell at one point, and he likes to bring that up quite often and talk about it. And I'm like, I never knew the guy. I'm sorry, but having said that, we have a tendency to forget that there's always somebody watching. Some are watching because they're learning. Some are watching because your life is different. They don't understand how you go through the challenges of life that you're going through, where your strength comes from, and they want that. Some are watching because they see that you're living and seem to be happier and more content in your life, and they want that. Some are watching because you're supposed to be a Christian. What does that look like? I may want that for myself. And some are watching because they're learning. We must remember, Jesus said there's always somebody watching, and sometimes we think about salt and light as something we do. You should be salt and you should be light, and we preach that. We should be salt and light, and yes, we should be salt and light, but it's not something that we do, it should be something that we are. And there's a difference between what I do and who I am. What I do is a conscious decision. Who I am is who I really truly come out to be. Salt is always salty. And light is always illuminating. It's the nature of those things. Salt doesn't have to try to be salty, and light doesn't have to try to be illuminating. It just happens as a result of who and what they are. And folks, we're supposed to be salt and light according to Jesus. Then he really challenges them. He says to them in verse 20 of Matthew 5, he says, I say to you that unless your righteousness exceeds the righteousness of the scribes and Pharisees, you'll by no means enter the kingdom of heaven. Well, these are the most religious guys they knew. That'd be like saying, you've got to be more righteous than all the elders and preachers that you know. Well, actually, literally, that's what he's saying here. He's saying you got to be more righteous than all your religious leaders. And people didn't really understand that. It was a challenge to them. They didn't know. And he goes further. Same chapter, a little bit later, same sermon. Jesus is still preaching the same sermon. He says, therefore you shall be perfect, just as your Father in heaven is perfect. And if you read the Greek, it says, exactly as your Father in heaven is perfect. I'm supposed to be just as perfect as God. That's what Jesus says in the sermon. And he goes on, he says, later in the same sermon, as he's finishing the sermon, he says, narrow is the gate and difficult the way that leads to life. There are few that find it. Jesus says it's not going to be easy. It's going to be hard. It's going to be difficult. We're going to have to do some things that, be more righteous than the religious leaders. Be as perfect as God is. It's going to be hard. That's what he says. Not very many people are going to be able to accomplish it. We need to see that and understand that, because people in Jesus' day, just like people today in our world, needed to be reminded that there's more to following God than just going through the motions and crossing our T's and dotting our I's. Now, it's important to cross our T's and dot our I's. There's no doubt about it. When God says, thou shalt not do this, we shouldn't do that. And when God says, thou shalt do this, we should do those things. There's no doubt about the crossing T's and dotting I's. But beginning in verse 21, which is where we're going to start with our lesson this morning, beginning in verse 21, Jesus is going to give us 6 different issues where he's going to shift the issue. Righteousness, not just following the rules, but being righteous. Again, it's not just about trying to be salt, it's about actually being salt. It's not about just trying to shine a light, but actually being a light in everything and every aspect of our lives. And he's going to say, righteousness is not just what we do, it's who we are on the inside. And that's what he's going to talk about as we talk about those things. And he's going to use this particular phraseology that we'll see over and over again. You have heard it said, but I say to you. And that's what he's going to use to kind of introduce the different topics as he does that. And again, he's saying, don't just be evil. Don't even just be good, or don't even just be better, but be perfect like your Father. Remember verse 48? And one of the ways that we as Christians should stand out from the world is that we ought to be different. We're called a peculiar people in the Bible. A peculiar people. We ought to be peculiar. The word for church, ecclesia, literally means those who have been called out. We are a royal priesthood. We've been called out from the world to live for God, and we ought to be different from the rest of the world. And what's sad is so many Christians in the world today, and as Jay House did Wednesday night, I'll use my air quotes on that, so many of the Christians in the world today they no longer see the value in being different. And so many Christians in the church today no longer see the value of being different. We want to, instead of standing out from the crowd, we want to fit in. We don't want people to talk about us. We don't want people to look down on us. We don't want people to judge us or anything like that. So we've got a whole generation of people, more than one generation. We've got generations of people who are trying to be like everybody else. We want to look like and be like everybody else, so we change the methodology of worship so that we're like everybody else. We change women's roles in the church so that we're like everybody else. We change our positions on baptism and instrumental music and all kinds of other things so that we can be like everybody else. And we quit being the distinctive church we're called to be, and we forget the warning of Jesus that the everybody else's, you know what he says? Narrow is the gate and few will enter. But the majority, if you want to be like them, he says the majority is not going to enter heaven. I don't want to be part of that majority that doesn't enter heaven. I don't think you do either. I don't think any of your friends or neighbors want to either. We're called to be different. And not just to act different, but to think different than the world does. That's what we're called to be. And when we're different, or when we think different, we will act differently. The longest sermon recorded by Jesus is this Sermon on the Mount, and he talks about everything from anxiety to letting your light shine. But most of it he spends on telling us how to think differently, and that's what we're going to talk about 6 times. He's going to tell us to think differently. We're going to look at those. We're going to try to get into them quickly and say, how are you going to handle 6 when you just now got through with your introduction? We're going to try to do them quick. Think differently about anger. That's the first thing he says, verses 21 through 26. That was our scripture reading, so I'm not going to repeat that. He said, you've heard it said, don't be angry or don't kill. And I'm telling you not to be angry. That's what Jesus says. I'm not going to reread it because we've already read that. We're not supposed to kill our brother. Most of us haven't committed that sin, okay? There are very few murderers in the congregation here that I know of. You may have done it, and I heard a guy say something about said his wife is missing, and they hadn't found her yet. So I don't know. I doubt if there's anybody here that's committed that sin. But it's so easy to fall into the trap of anger. It's so easy to allow anger to take control of our lives. We'll hold a grudge forever. I mean, I'm not the kind of person to hold a grudge, but in 1972, when Tennessee was playing Arkansas and the referees made the bet, okay, let's go back, okay? We'll hold a grudge forever. And we'll think hateful thoughts about others. We may not say it out loud, but we'll think hateful thoughts about other folks a lot of times because we're mad at them still after all these years. We'll call them names, either to their face or behind their back, or maybe just under our breath, because we're mad at them, and we're not letting that go. Our anger is wrong. There's such a thing as righteous indignation. There's such a thing as righteous anger. We should be angry at sin. We should be angry when we see somebody abusing a child. We should be angry when we see a government that oppresses its people. We should be angry when we see people being mistreated and mishandled and sin reigning in the world. That should make us angry. But we don't have to be angry about the things that we're angry about most of the time, because very rarely are those the things that bring our total wrath. What brings our total wrath is when you hurt me. It's more personal. It's not about for somebody else. It's about me. And that kind of anger is sinful anger, and we should try to avoid that. Jesus says that by our attitude toward our brother, we could be guilty of murder without even raising a hand in violence. It's a different way of thinking. We need to train ourselves to love others even when we're wronged. He's not just saying suck it up when we're angry. No, what he's saying is that we need to go make it right. I think sometimes we're afraid of that part. It says if somebody has wronged us, we're supposed to go to them and try to make it right. That's not easy. That's not easy, because 9 times out of 10, they don't know or care that they've made us upset. And so we're wasting our time. And at best, maybe we've managed to suck it up and it's not an issue anymore. When we go to them and they don't care, now we've made it an issue all over again, and now we're angrier than we were before. Jesus said, make it right. Do the best you can to make it right. Paul says, as much as is in you, to live at peace with all men in Romans 12. We need to try to make it right. And yeah, they may not appreciate it. They may not remember it. They may not care. You know what? You can let it go. That's what Jesus says. You can let it go when that happens. We're supposed to be able to do that. The Pharisees would have never murdered. Oh, but they thought hateful thoughts about other people. I mean, look at us. I'm a Pharisee. I'm not like that sinner over there. That's the way they did it. our righteousness has to surpass theirs. That includes how we handle angry, and that means we have to think different. He goes on to say we need to think differently about lust. Well, there's a hard one in the world we live in today. We live in a country that's obsessed with sex. And as we look at the text that Jesus says, you've heard it was said to those of old, you shall not commit adultery, but I say to you that whoever looks at a woman to lust for her has already committed adultery with her in his heart. If your right eye causes you to sin, pluck it out, cast it from you, for it's more profitable for you that one of your members perish than for your whole body to be cast into hell. And if your right hand causes you to sin, cut it off, cast it from you, for it's more profitable for you that one of your members perish than for your whole body to be cast into hell. That's the text there for that. Jesus wants us to understand that being moral is about more than just not engaging in immoral activity. You know, it's about not thinking immoral thoughts. Actually, it's about thinking moral thoughts. Being moral is actually about thinking of people in a positive way instead of thinking of people in a using way or a negative way. We often preach about premarital sex being a sin. We often preach about adultery being a sin, about fornication being a sin. We'll talk about the different sins of sexuality. Here's the rule that God put in place from the beginning of time. One man and one woman for one lifetime. And the sexual relationship is a part of that relationship between that man and his wife. Every other sexual relationship you can think of that falls outside of the boundary of a husband and his wife is a sin according to the Word of God. So we don't have to spend hours talking about what exactly is fornication or what exactly is homosexuality or is transgender a sin or is this a sin or is that a sin. Every sexual relationship outside of that between a man and his wife, according to God, is a sin. That ought to narrow it down enough that we can see it, just like that. It ought to be easy enough for us to understand. Sometimes I think we fail to cover what the Bible says when we talk about those things. And Jesus is very serious about that. You know, when's the last time you heard a sermon against pornography? And yet that's one of the biggest issues in the world today. In a congregation this size, the odds are that there are at least, and I'm talking about Christians, I'm not talking about the world. In the world, there'd be no doubt. But in a congregation this size, I would be willing to bet that there are some in here that are struggling with pornography. It's a real thing. It's an ugly thing. Jesus wants us to understand that we need to think differently about people. We shouldn't harbor anger, but we also shouldn't objectify people. We shouldn't view people of the opposite sex as an object of lust. You know, the Pharisees didn't respect others. Well, we're supposed to be better than that. You know, we can't object somebody sexually any more than we can objectify them based upon their race, or objectify them based upon their nationality, or objectify them based on the color of their skin or who their parents were. It's wrong to do any of those things. The problem is the one is secretive. Nobody knows you're doing it, so you can get away with it. But Jesus says this is pretty serious. He says it's serious enough that maybe you need to do something radical. Maybe you need to pluck out your eye or cut off your hand. This is a serious sin. Jesus wants us to understand this is serious. He wants us to understand that completely. And you know, we need to remove, that's what he's saying, the things that make us stumble. Here's a hint for some. There are probably some in here that don't need to be able to browse your internet by yourself. You might need to lose your privacy a little bit. There are some in here who might need to put a program like Safe Eyes on your computer so that when you try to go to a place you shouldn't go to, somebody else is alerted and they can call you and they can say, hey, I noticed you were trying to go to such and such. I'm sorry, I mistyped it. My wife one time years ago was trying to buy some supplies for Vacation Bible School, and there's a company called Oriental Trading Post. And so she was going to Oriental Trading Post, and she typed in something wrong, and all of a sudden she calls me. I'm at the office. She calls me, "Come home right now." And I said, "Why?" And she said, "I hit the wrong button on the computer." And so I went home, and that's back when pop-ups came up a whole lot. Nowadays you got pop-up blockers on your computer. There were about 200 pages of Oriental pornography pages that had started popping up on the computer. She didn't know what to do. She had our daughter in there trying to help her to close it, and she had made our son go hide in the bedroom because she didn't want him to see what was popping up on the screen. And I got home, I didn't want to see what was on the screen. I did the thing any normal guy would do if you think of that. I unplugged it. Restart it. Let's get out of this. Wow. Yeah, I don't remember what site she went to. She probably couldn't tell you either. But it wasn't Oriental Trading, and it wasn't VBS Supplies. I'm telling you, you can go there accidentally. So maybe sometimes it'd be nice to have an extra set of eyes watching over your shoulder and say, "Hey, wait, that's not where you meant to go, or that's not where you want to go." That's a good thing to have to understand. We need to think differently about divorce. That's what Jesus says. We live in a society where it's accepted. When I was growing up, you young people will never you'll never deal with this in your life probably, because it's not that way anymore. When I was growing up, if somebody was divorced, you never said somebody was divorced out loud. You whispered it. You always said, "They're divorced." Or, "She used to be married to so-and-so," or "He used to be married to so-and-so." You never ever said it out loud. And now it's a norm. It's such a norm that more than half the marriages in our country end in divorce. That's a kind of a crooked perspective, because what happens is those third and fourth and fifth marriages, they're kind of like leftovers. They partake for a little while and they throw away what's left and they go get some more. And so those marriages actually end at a rate of somewhere around 90%. By the way, we were driving the other day and we were listening to that great philosopher and theologian, Dr. Laura. Come on, that's supposed to deserve a little bit of a ooh laugh or whatever. And she was talking to some lady, and she was talking to a lady about her husband's situation and her stepchildren and stuff like that. And she said, "If he's on his third marriage, why would you think yours is going to work with him?" Folks, there are reasons to get a divorce, and Jesus talks about those. And we're going to talk a little bit about some of that. Maybe we need to think of that sometimes and talk about divorce, because we don't talk about it very much. It's not popular. It's not popular at all. In the first century, there were two main schools of thought. There was the school of Hillel and the school of Shammai. These were famous rabbis from back hundreds of years before Jesus. I guess hundreds of years before Jesus. But anyhow, they had come up with their ideology about divorce, and their thought was, the school of Shammai said, you can only get a divorce for serious offenses like adultery. Now, it could be other sexual offenses, but it had to be something serious sexually in order to get a divorce. The school of Hillel was, if her husband finds her unbecoming for any reason, he doesn't like the way she cuts her hair, he doesn't like the way she dresses, he doesn't like she burned the toast, then they could get a divorce. Shammai said that marriage was a covenant between two people and God. And so therefore it could not be broken by either one unless they had broken their relationship with God, sexual sin. Hillel said that marriage is simply a contract between two people, and that either one of them can void the contract anytime they want to, for any reason that they want to, but only men had the right to file for divorce, except for the Jews had come up with a loophole where a woman could go to court and say, my husband is not being the husband he wants to be, and old Joe over there would make a better husband, I think, but I need a divorce in order to do that. My husband won't give me a divorce, and I don't know what to do. And the courts would shame him into giving her a divorce sometimes. And so That's the world that Jesus lived in when he started talking about this. It's true that God hates divorce. There's no doubt about that. He even says it. God hates divorce. I mean, that's pretty easy. It's true that that's the case, but Jesus says that we need to think differently about our spouses. You know, it's not just our spouses are not just something to be discarded when we grow weary of them. My wife, sometimes she'll say something to me like, I love you, and I'll say, I love you too. And she said, do you really? And I say, I have to. It's a rule. You know? or I promised God I would, something like that. Because folks, there should be no doubt about it. Marriage is a covenant relationship between two people and God. It's always that. It always has been that. When the world tries to redefine marriage and say, well, marriage can be between two people of the same sex, or marriage can be between this or that, or marriage means this, or marriage is a religious term, has been from the beginning of time, between two people and their God, between a man and his wife. That's what the Bible says. A long time before there were any governments made by man to say, well, we're going to redefine marriage. You can't redefine what God has already defined. You can try, but it doesn't change anything. Some of the Pharisees had been divorcing their spouse for just any old reason and then saying, they didn't do anything wrong. We gave her a certificate of divorce. Hey, everything's hunky-dory. Jesus says we need to think differently about it altogether. Instead of being flippant with our marriage covenants. Husbands, I'm talking to you. Wives, I'm talking to you. We ought to recognize this is a covenant between us and God. At least 7 different times, husbands are told to love their wives. At least 7 different times, wives are told to respect their husbands. When you look at psychologists and they say, what's the number one need of males in the world? You know what they say? Respect. You know what they say the number one need is for women in the world? To feel loved. Amazingly, that God said husbands should love their wives and wives should respect their husbands, almost like he made us and knew the rules. Think differently about trustworthiness. Ooh, there's a hard one. Matthew 5, as we continue through the text of Jesus' sermon. Again, you've heard it was said to those of old, you shall not swear falsely, but shall perform your oaths to the Lord. But I say to you, do not swear at all, neither by heaven, for it's God's throne, nor by the earth, for it's his footstool, nor by Jerusalem, for it's the city of the great king. Nor shall you swear by your head, because you can't make one hair black or white or black. But let your yes be yes, and your no, no, for whatever is more than these is from the evil one. You know, despite the fact that there are biblical origins for oath-taking, the practice had become so corrupted that there was actually a backlash among the rabbinic traditions. They had 3 different ideas of oaths. This is in the time of Jesus. They had vain oaths. A vain oath is when I swear to something that's impossible or untrue. You know, I swear that I'll bring you $1 million next Thursday. That's not going to happen. Okay? Or a false oath. That's where we actually use God's name to lie. And then there's a technical evasion. That's where, okay, I'll make a technical distinction. And you say, well, what does that really mean and what does that look like? How about an example for that? Jesus says that people said, well, there's a difference between swearing by the temple and swearing by the altar and swearing by the gold that's on the altar. You know, if I swear by the gold that's on the altar, I have to keep my vow. And then he says, which is more righteous or which is more holy, the gold or the altar itself that makes the gold holy? And he tells them it's a fallacy what you're doing. But there are technical things they were doing to try to get around keeping their word or keeping their promise or doing what they said they would do. And for those reasons, many of the Jews in the first century were already at the point where they favored plain, truthful speech. And so when Jesus said, let your yes be yes and your no be no, That was actually what many of the Pharisees had been teaching for a while. You don't need all these oaths. You don't need all this stuff. If you're telling the truth, you don't need to swear that it's true. If you're really telling the truth, you're telling the truth. And that ought to be the way we are as Christians. One place where we ought to always stand out as Christians is in our truthfulness. You know, we're to be completely different about how we communicate with each other. We don't have to swear in order to be trusted. You know, I've borrowed money to buy a car over the telephone with my word, talking to my banker in the past. Nowadays, I can still do the same thing. Maybe it's because my word has proven to be true all these years. You know, we make deals with each other, we make promises to each other. Do we keep our promises? Do we keep our deals? Do we say what's true when we talk to each other? Christians, as Christians, we should never have to preface any statement we make, well, to be honest, well, truthfully, well, if you really want to know the truth, it ought to automatically be assumed that what we're saying is true, because what we say ought to be true. That's thinking differently than the world around us. Jesus goes on, he says we ought to think differently about vengeance. Verses 38 through 40, you've heard it was said, an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth, but I tell you not to resist an evil person. But whoever slaps you on your right cheek, turn the other to him also. If anyone wants to sue you and take your tunic, let him have your cloak also. And whoever compels you to go 1 mile, go with him 2. Give to him who asks, and from him who wants to borrow from you, do not turn away. The Romans had instituted a policy in Palestine. They could make you carry their stuff. They could make you house them overnight for up to 3 nights, but they could make you carry their belongings for a mile when they were traveling. The soldiers didn't have to carry their own belongings. They could make you do it. And there was an understanding among most Jews, I'll go 1 mile, but I won't go 1 step further. I will go the 1 mile, but I'm not taking another step past that, because you can compel me, but I don't have to like it. And so what Jesus is saying here is instead of thinking of how to get even, we ought to think of ways to serve. And so he uses this idea of that second mile service thing there. Instead of fighting back, give more. You want to change the world? When they start treating you bad, when they start misusing you, when they start talking bad to you, be nice in return. And watch and see what happens. It's transformative in the world that we live in. You know, think of the impact it would have on the world if we sought ways to serve instead of ways to get even. Think about that. That's thinking differently. He goes on, he says, think differently about our enemies. Believe it or not, this is the 6th one. We're almost done with this. Boy, it's a deep sermon. You've heard it was said, you shall love your neighbor and hate your enemy. But I say to you, love your enemies, bless those who curse you, do good to those who hate you, and pray for those who spitefully use and persecute you, that you may be sons of your Father in heaven, for he makes his sun to rise on the evil and on the good, sends his rain on the just and on the unjust. For if you love those who love you, what reward have you? Do not even the tax collectors do the same? If you greet your brethren only, what do you do more than others? Do not even the tax collectors do so? Therefore you shall be perfect, just as your Father in heaven is perfect. You know, when we think about those things, we don't always think in terms of loving our neighbor like that. And we don't always think in terms of foregoing our vengeance. You know, Leviticus 19:18 says that we're not to have vengeance and grudges against our enemy. But you know, this is the only one of all of these you've heard it said, and I say to you, this is the only one. The Old Testament never actually says, hate your enemies. He says, you've heard it was said, love your neighbor and hate your enemies. That wasn't said by God. He never said that. Now, in the Old Testament, sometimes when they were at war, they called down God to destroy their enemies. There's no doubt about that. But nowhere were they ever told to hate anyone. We should never hate anyone. And I think sometimes we think it's okay because he says, you've heard it said, and in the back of our minds we hear, oh, it's okay to hate your enemies. But that's exactly the opposite of what he's saying there. He's saying that we ought to love even the ones that use us despitefully. You know, in the Old Testament, they're even told, if your enemy has a stray animal, you're supposed to get their stray animal and return it to them. If your enemy's ox falls into a ditch, you're supposed to get the animal out and protect the animal and keep it safe and take care of your enemy. That was always God's plan. Jesus is just reminding them that that's what it's supposed to be like. They've twisted God's words. They've twisted his plan. We ought to be offering blessings towards everyone. And what makes this example so special is that if we do this, we'll be like God. Because you see, there's something that you might have forgotten. And it's important. When we were still enemies of God, he sent his son to die on the cross for us. That's how much he loved us. Aren't you glad he didn't repay us for the evil we did, and rather gave us his grace and his mercy? You see, Jesus is saying that we ought to think differently. We need to start thinking like our Father. That's what he expected from them 2,000 years ago, and that's what he expects from us today, is that we think differently. So many people are looking for a way to stand out from the crowd. Everybody wants to stand out. I promise you, it's in the way we dress, it's in the way we color our hair, it's in we got off that cruise ship. I promise you, I saw more tattoos on that cruise ship than I've seen in my whole life anywhere in the world. People trying to express themselves. The way they dress, the way they do their hair, the way we talk, and the way we act, we want to stand out. Everybody does. That's why in the military, everybody wants a ribbon somewhere, something to identify them from everybody else's uniform. They want to look different. They want to stand out. But if we really want to stand out in the world, we don't have to be like the world. We just need to think differently. Because we will stand out when we think differently. When we think differently about the things that are most important in life, we will stand out. Maybe today's the day you need to re-examine your life and to start thinking differently about some areas in your life. Maybe you need prayers from the church. Maybe it's time for you to commit your life to God for the first time. You're ready to be baptized into Christ. Maybe it's time for you to come back to God because you haven't committed your life to God in a long time. Maybe you've wandered so far away that you don't even know where God is anymore, and it's time for you to come back and to humbly recognize that God has not changed. God has not moved. And the same things that Jesus taught 2,000 years ago about thinking differently about the things of this world are just as valid today as they ever were. Maybe you need to respond to the Lord's invitation. We're going to give you that opportunity to do so while we stand and sing.